73.76 crimes per 1,000 residents. Let that sink in for a second. We're talking about Deanwood, a neighborhood sitting just miles from the United States Capitol, where lawmakers debate policy while this community drowns in violence. This isn't some distant problem in a forgotten corner of America. This is happening in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, where the crime rate in this single neighborhood puts it at the absolute top of the most dangerous areas in the entire city. To put this in perspective, Deanwood residents face a 1 in 14 chance of becoming a victim of crime. That's not per year or per decade. That's their overall statistical likelihood of experiencing criminal victimization while living there. The national average hovers around 1 in 43, which means living in Deanwood makes you 3 times more likely to become a crime victim compared to the average American. But here's where it gets even more striking. Compared to other neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. itself, Deanwood residents are 148% more likely to experience crime. Located in the northeast quadrant of the district, Deanwood spans an area where the streets tell stories that statistics alone can't capture. This isn't just about numbers on a police report. This is about families who've lived here for generations, watching their community transform from a place of hope into something nobody planned for. The neighborhood sits in Ward 7, an area that consistently reports the highest crime rates across all of DC's 8 wards. What makes this particularly tragic is the proximity to power. You can literally see the monuments from certain parts of the neighborhood. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, all those symbols of American democracy and prosperity, they're right there. And yet, in Deanwood, residents navigate a completely different reality. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Georgetown, just across town, feels like a different universe entirely, with its boutique shops and million-dollar townhouses. Meanwhile, in Deanwood, people are calculating which route home minimizes their exposure to danger. The 73.76 figure represents reported crimes per 1,000 residents. But anyone familiar with crime statistics knows that reported crimes tell only part of the story. Many incidents never make it into official records. Victims might not call the police because they've lost faith in the system's ability to help, or because they fear retaliation, or simply because they become so accustomed to crime that certain incidents don't even seem worth reporting anymore. When we dig into what those 73.76 crimes actually consist of, the picture gets more specific and somehow worse. Violent crimes dominate the statistics in ways that should alarm anyone paying attention. We're talking about aggravated assaults, armed robberies, and shootings that have become disturbingly routine for residents. The violent crime rate alone would be enough to classify Deanwood as high risk, but it's the combination of violent and property crimes that creates this perfect storm. Aggravated assaults represent a significant portion of violent incidents. These aren't simple disputes or shoving matches. These are attacks involving weapons or resulting in serious bodily injury. The frequency of these assaults has created an atmosphere where confrontation can escalate to violence in moments, and residents have learned to navigate social situations with extreme caution. Arguments over parking spots, disputes between neighbors, disagreements that in safer neighborhoods might result in angry words. In Deanwood, they can turn deadly. Armed robberies happen with a frequency that residents describe as almost predictable. Certain corners, certain times of day, certain circumstances create patterns that locals learn to recognize and avoid. Convenience stores have been hit multiple times. Gas stations install elaborate security systems that still don't prevent incidents. People walking home from bus stops become targets. The robberies aren't always about large sums of money either. Sometimes it's phones, sometimes it's shoes, sometimes it's whatever the victim happens to be carrying. Property crimes add another layer to the problem. Burglaries occur regularly, with homes and businesses both targeted. Car break-ins are so common that many residents have stopped keeping anything visible in their vehicles. Some don't even bother locking their cars anymore, figuring that replacing a broken window costs more than anything inside worth stealing. Vandalism and property destruction happen frequently enough that many building owners have simply stopped maintaining their properties to the same standards they might elsewhere, knowing that repairs might be undone within weeks. The geographic distribution of these crimes within Deanwood itself isn't even. Some blocks experience higher concentrations of criminal activity than others. Areas near the Minnesota Avenue Metro Station, certain stretches along Kenilworth Avenue, and pockets of residential streets that have become informal territories all show elevated incident rates. Understanding these internal variations matters, because it shows how crime creates its own geography within an already struggling neighborhood. Understanding Deanwood's crime problem requires looking at the economic conditions that form its foundation. The median household income in this neighborhood sits dramatically below the DC average, creating an economic gulf that's hard to overstate. While Washington, D.C. overall has become one of the most expensive cities in America, with wealth concentrated in neighborhoods like Georgetown, DuPont Circle, and Capitol Hill, Deanwood exists in a parallel economic universe. Unemployment rates in the area exceed both city and national averages by significant margins. Finding stable, legal employment proves difficult for residents for multiple reasons. The neighborhood lacks major employers. Many residents don't own cars, making it difficult to access job opportunities elsewhere in the metropolitan area. Public transportation exists, but requires time and money that complicate an already challenging job search. Some residents face criminal records from past convictions, making employment even harder to secure even when they're actively trying to turn their lives around. The lack of legitimate economic opportunities creates a vacuum that illegal economies rush to fill. Drug markets operate openly on certain corners. Other underground economic activities flourish in the absence of legal alternatives. For young people growing up in Deanwood, they see two paths. They can struggle through underfunded schools, face limited job prospects, and watch their families barely survive on minimum wage jobs. Or they can make quick money through illegal means. It's not that everyone chooses the illegal path, most don't, but enough do that it sustains the criminal ecosystem. Property values tell their own story about Deanwood's economic challenges. Homes that would command premium prices in other DC neighborhoods sell for fractions of those amounts here. A property in Deanwood might list for $150,000, while a comparable structure in a safer neighborhood could easily exceed $600,000 or $700,000. This creates a trap for homeowners. They can't sell their properties for enough to relocate to safer areas. Their largest asset, their home, has become essentially worthless compared to properties elsewhere in the city. The economic segregation within Washington, D.C. has intensified over the past 2 decades. As the city has attracted more wealth and development, that growth has concentrated in already prosperous areas. Deanwood and similar neighborhoods haven't shared in the city's economic boom. If anything, they've fallen further behind as everything around them has gotten more expensive. Grocery stores charge more, transportation costs rise, but wages for residents haven't kept pace. This economic abandonment has real consequences for crime rates because poverty and crime correlate strongly, especially when that poverty exists alongside visible wealth nearby. Deanwood wasn't always synonymous with danger. The neighborhood was founded in 1871 as one of Washington, D.C.'s first suburbs developed specifically for African American residents. In those early decades, Deanwood represented opportunity and progress. Black families who had been enslaved just years before could own property here, build homes, establish businesses, and create a community on their own terms. That historical significance shouldn't be forgotten, even as we discuss current problems. Throughout the early and mid-20th century, Deanwood maintained a strong sense of community identity. The neighborhood produced notable figures, including Marvin Gaye, who grew up here and whose musical legacy remains a source of pride. In those years, Deanwood featured tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, active churches, and neighborhood institutions that bound residents together. People knew their neighbors. Block associations organized community events. Parents felt comfortable letting children play outside. The demographic composition has remained consistently African American, currently sitting at approximately 92%. This demographic stability over more than a century speaks to roots that run deep. Families have lived in Deanwood for generations, with grandparents, parents, and children all calling the same neighborhood home. This continuity creates strong cultural ties, but also means that when conditions deteriorate, entire family networks find themselves trapped in increasingly difficult circumstances. The transformation from thriving community to high crime neighborhood didn't happen overnight. It resulted from decades of policy decisions, economic shifts, and institutional neglect. As DC's economy changed from government-focused to more service and tech-oriented, jobs that didn't require advanced degrees became scarcer. Manufacturing jobs that once provided stable middle-class incomes disappeared. The crack epidemic of the 1980s devastated the community. White flight and then black middle-class flight removed stabilizing influences and economic resources. Urban renewal projects that promised revitalization often failed to materialize or, when they did, displaced existing residents without improving conditions for those who remained. The construction of highways and infrastructure sometimes cut through neighborhoods like Deanwood, disrupting community cohesion. Schools that once served as community anchors saw funding cut and quality decline. The criminal justice policies of recent decades incarcerated large numbers of Deanwood residents, removing wage earners from families, and creating cycles of incarceration that affected multiple generations. The daily experience of living in Deanwood involves constant calculation and adjustment. Residents develop elaborate mental maps of their neighborhood, categorizing streets and corners by danger level. They know which routes home are safer, which businesses to avoid after dark, which parks their children absolutely cannot enter. This hypervigilance becomes second nature, a survival skill passed from parents to children like any other life lesson. Simple activities that people in safer neighborhoods take for granted become complicated operations in Deanwood. Walking to the corner store requires considering the time of day, who might be outside, and whether the potential for confrontation is worth the trip. Parents face impossible choices about allowing children outside to play. Keep kids inside and they become isolated, potentially falling behind developmentally. Let them play outside and they're exposed to violence, drug activity, and dangerous influences. Neither option feels acceptable, but parents must choose anyway. The psychological toll of living with chronic violence shouldn't be underestimated. Studies have shown that residents of high-crime neighborhoods experience rates of post-traumatic stress disorder comparable to war veterans. Constant exposure to violence, even when not directly victimized, creates lasting trauma. Children growing up in these conditions often struggle with anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems that reflect their environment's impact on developing brains. Adults experience chronic stress that manifests in physical health problems. Many residents describe a kind of emotional numbing that develops over time. The first shooting they heard kept them awake all night. By the 10th or 20th, they barely react. This adaptation helps people function in impossible circumstances, but it also represents a loss of something fundamental. When gunshots become background noise, when crime scene tape is just another neighborhood fixture, something has broken in how we relate to violence and safety. Despite everything, many residents can't simply leave. Economic constraints trap people in Deanwood, even when they desperately want out. Moving requires money for deposits, moving costs, and higher rent in safer areas. It requires having employment that makes that higher rent affordable. It requires having good enough credit to pass housing applications. For families living paycheck to paycheck, for people with criminal records that limit housing options, for elderly residents on fixed incomes, leaving simply isn't realistic. They're not staying by choice. They're staying because they have nowhere else to go. The Metropolitan Police Department assigns officers to patrol Deanwood, but residents report that police presence feels both inadequate and adversarial. Response times to emergency calls in the neighborhood are slower than in other parts of DC. When police do respond, interactions often feel transactional rather than protective. Years of tense relations between law enforcement and the community have created mutual distrust that undermines public safety efforts, even when individual officers genuinely try to help. Community policing programs exist on paper, but their implementation in Deanwood has been inconsistent at best. Officers rotate through the neighborhood without building long-term relationships with residents. Programs designed to foster cooperation between police and community members struggle with participation because residents have seen too many initiatives announced with fanfare only to fade away when media attention moves elsewhere. Trust has to be earned through sustained engagement, and that sustained engagement has rarely materialized. Various government programs have been announced over the years targeting Deanwood's problems. Federal grants for violence prevention, DC government initiatives for neighborhood revitalization, public-private partnerships promising investment and opportunity. Some programs deliver modest benefits. A youth center opens, providing after-school programming for a few dozen kids. A job training program helps some residents gain new skills. But these efforts remain small relative to the scope of problems they're meant to address. The fundamental disconnect is between the scale of intervention needed and the resources actually committed. Transforming a neighborhood with Deanwood's challenges would require sustained, coordinated effort across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Employment programs, education improvements, infrastructure investment, violence prevention, mental health services, recreational facilities, small business support. All of these would need to happen together and be maintained for years to create lasting change. Instead, what typically happens is a single program addressing one dimension, underfunded and temporary, expected to somehow reverse decades of decline. Political attention follows a predictable cycle. During election campaigns, candidates visit Deanwood, promise change, and move on. Once in office, priorities shift to issues affecting wealthier, more politically connected constituencies. When a particularly shocking crime occurs in or near Deanwood, there's brief media coverage and renewed promises. Then, attention fades. Residents have watched this pattern repeat enough times that many have stopped believing that help is coming from outside their community. Looking at Deanwood's situation, we have to ask uncomfortable questions about what kind of society we're building when neighborhoods like this exist in our nation's capital. The 73.76 crimes per 1,000 residents isn't just a statistic. It represents thousands of individual victimizations, traumatized families, lives derailed by violence, and potential squandered by circumstance. Behind every decimal point are real people trying to live their lives in conditions that no one should have to accept as normal. The solutions get discussed regularly, but rarely implemented seriously. Economic investment in the neighborhood could create legitimate opportunities that compete with illegal markets. Better schools could prepare young people for careers that lift them out of poverty. Violence prevention programs that actually receive adequate funding might interrupt the cycles of retaliation and revenge that fuel ongoing conflicts. Mental health services could address trauma that drives some criminal behavior. None of this is mysterious or unprecedented. We know what works because we've seen it work in other places that made the commitment. But real solutions require sustained commitment of resources and political will. They require acknowledging that fixing Deanwood benefits everyone, not just its residents. Crime doesn't respect neighborhood boundaries. Violence in one area affects the entire region's reputation and economic vitality. The human potential being wasted in Deanwood could contribute to the broader community if given the chance. This isn't charity. It's an investment in the city's future and an obligation to residents who deserve the same safety and opportunity available elsewhere in Washington, D.C. The truth is that Deanwood's continued existence as a high-crime ghetto represents a policy choice, even if that choice is made through inaction rather than explicit decision. We could address these problems if we prioritize them. We don't, and that reflects something troubling about our collective values and priorities. When neighborhoods descend into chaos, and we accept that as inevitable, when we write off entire communities as beyond saving, when we allow massive inequality to persist within view of the Capitol building, we reveal what we actually value versus what we claim to value. Deanwood isn't an isolated anomaly. Similar neighborhoods exist in cities across America, each with its own statistics and stories, but sharing common patterns of abandonment and neglect. The question isn't whether we know how to improve these situations. We do. The question is whether we care enough about the people living there to actually do the work required. So far, the answer has been no. Until that changes, places like Deanwood will continue producing statistics that should shame us all, while residents continue living with consequences that no American should have to endure.